Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So leading or facilitating change in complex organizations isn't for the faint of heart. It demands a blend of the right mindset, resilience, self-awareness, and skills. So today we're diving into what it really takes to navigate the challenge of change in organizations. We've invited one of the very best to help us with this question, Mark Stringer. Mark is subject group lead for people, work, Organisational Psychology at the leading business school at Birbeck University. Mark both convenes and teaches on several modules, including organisations and change perspectives, HRM professional development, and learning and work and well-being. And he continues to supervise numerous masters and HRM projects across the board. Mark is passionate about supporting research that crosses disciplines and challenging traditional thinking and embraces diverse perspectives. He finds endless fascination in using psychoanalytic, structural and post-structuralist approaches to rethink questions and conventional views of work and organizations. Now, full disclosure, one of the things that I do with the CIPD is I chair the CIPD London OD group. And for our big end of year event last year, we invited Mark to be a panelist. So Mark's extensive academic experience is underpinned by a fascinating career that's encompassed both public and private operational and HRM work within banking, retail, and the arts. And he's had senior roles at iconic organizations that all of us will know and all of us will be fascinated. So Sotheby's, Danny's own place of worship, the British Library.
I was there yesterday.
And HMV. And he understands the terrain of organizations, having worked in financial accountancy, product management, marketing, OD, L&D functions, and most recently as director of both HR and operations. So his research projects have been really interesting as well, looking at the stories of women's journeys to reach board level positions. And his experience includes an MSc in organizational behavior, a PhD in organizational psychology, and he's also HR Magazine's on the most influential list, 2023 and 2024 as well. And he also has a deep love of music, which will hopefully play a part in today's conversation too. So welcome, Mark. It's really great to have you. Danny and I have really been looking forward to this conversation all week long.
Brilliant to have you with us, Mark. Thank you for joining us. So just to kick us off, just tell us a bit more about what you do, the work that you do, and your kind of focus of interest.
Birbeck has, and in the business school, it's the group of people, work and organisational psychology. It's recently being expanded. We've been through an organisational change ourselves over the last 2 years at Birbeck, much like a lot of higher education organisations are having to do. The news today and yesterday kind of speaks to some of the issues that we're facing in that. And what I continue to find fascinating, and I think this is partly because of the student cohort and body that we tend to have at Birbeck, which is for those students who are generally still working or have worked or have just begun their. And because what is fascinating is that the students, we learn as academics so much from our students as well, because we are pushed, because those who come to our classrooms online or of an evening are those who are, they are working, they are feeling and experiencing these same issues, and they come to us to perhaps find a different way of reframing their own careers, or maybe changing their careers, or if they're starting their careers, to think about ways in which they can perhaps work in a way which is going to be beneficial for them and for the organizations they work in. So just to give you a brief overview, the department, we cover the masters that we offer, it's around organizational governance, around organizational psychology, HRM studies, career coaching and counselling, management consultancy and organisational change, and business psych for undergrad. So we have a lot of students who come in for undergrad and then carry on working with us at masters and in both professional doctorate and PhD. The module that I teach this term is organisations and change perspectives, as you mentioned, Garen. And within that, I think and again, it's a privilege to be able to teach it. And what I've always aimed to do within it is, bearing in mind my own experiences in organizations, is not to give the students 9 weeks of stuff which they will probably have been exposed to and have experienced previously. And what I mean by that, and I need to kind of counter that comment, which is not to say that isn't of worth. However, in organizational change, one of the constant refrains is that, why does it all pretty much fail? Well, why is there such a high failure rate in organizational change? Now, my argument for providing a different lens, different view over these 9 weeks for our students is to say, well, if that's the case, we really need to stop doing the same things that we've always done before and having the same discussions, the same approaches. And again, this is a mantra which I utilize across all my kind of teaching and research, which is to say, well, if we need change, we need to do something different. So to answer your question, Danny, is to give the students a space to recognize that might be slightly anxiety inducing for them, because they will have come from organizations and spaces and previous learning, arguably, which says if you want to change an organization, then you need to do X, Y, and Z, and you need to do this, and you need to do that, and then you'll get this. And in some cases, there's the elements of that which we all need, but I kind of leave that at the front door at the beginning of the term and say, well, yeah, okay, well, if we know that, and if we believe that that's problematic, then we need to look at it in a different way. And so therefore we then spend the next 9 weeks exploring differing ways of looking at organizations and change. And what do we mean by change? And the kind of the temporal aspects of that. And what I mean is, is change episodic? Is it something which happens in one particular time and frame, or is it continuous? And actually, is it constructed by us as we go through and doing it, which I think is always an important point for those students who are perhaps consultants and wanting to become consultants, because it's a sense of, yes, you may be asked to come in and do a project, but that is quite a kind of sort of normative and a very kind of black and white way of looking at change, that somehow you can just come in and go, I've got 3 months to do this, and then at the end of those 3 months we will have done X, Y, and Z. And which again, organizations love rationality. They love to be able to, because you have to get it through stakeholders to be able to pay for this stuff, but also you have to think about all the context which organizations are in. And certainly in the last 5 years that's been exacerbated. The news that's traveled across from the Atlantic in the last week or so, arguably is going to have some large implications for organizations. Brexit still has. There's lots of things which are coming together in these last few weeks which kind of resonate with what wider change has taken place on the global economy over the last 10 years. So I think what we aim to do is that. And there is anxiety because I'll be quite open and transparent. I'll say, well, if you stick to an end step model of change, prepare for it to fail. And it will fail in ways which you haven't even conceived of, because those kind of approaches arguably take a very simplistic view to what change is, because it's about management, or as I like to call it, the impossibility of management or of leadership, because those tasks are quite impossible. To be able to say that you've got a project plan, and arguably again, a project plan is out of date as soon as it's printed. So it's about, well, how can we utilize the thinking behind that, but also start to open it up and think about, well, what are the effects of OD? What's the effects of the kind of the institutional context that organizations find themselves? What about culture? What about loss, grief, and trauma within an organization? What about politics? What about leadership itself? What about chaos? And all of these are within our lives, let alone organizational lives. This is, and again, I think it's trying to break down that barriers to say, well, work is just an extension of our life. It's something which, if we think we can, we can park ourselves at the door and become an authentic worker as soon as we walk through that door. Again, we need to kind of problematize that, because that's again quite a rational way of looking at things. So that's what we aim and try to do in those, and make the connections across all of them, the courses, because our whole student cohort takes that. So that's OP and HRM and change consultants. So it's a big cohort. It's about 200 students, and they all come from differing views. And again, to be open and honest, there's some students which really don't like that approach because they are so wedded to certain ways of being. We're asking them to change. We're asking them to reflect on their professional identity and the way they do things. So that's interesting, because I can then send that message back to them, say, well, what do you find uncomfortable about this as being a change? Because this means something to you. And I think one of the things that I have become more emboldened in talking to about the students is that change itself, organization or personal or whatever, it really is an embodied experience, and the effects that it has upon us as workers, change consultants, as human beings, is sometimes immeasurable. And the ways in which we are asked to throw our entire body, mind, spirit into this type of situations cannot be discounted, and it has to be taken into account. I think that, again, asking the students to perhaps be a little bit more gentle and a bit more humble in that kind of approach, I think is a really important thing for them to go back out, and when they're being asked to take on projects or lead change or be part of change, or is to reflect upon and say, well, how do I enact this? How do I perform what I'm learning back into the workplace? And one of the joys of doing this job is, even this term, so I've got new students who've joined who have already begin to speak about how emboldened they have become already to be able to go back into organizational spaces and to challenge, but to challenge objectively, and to kind of think about using this new language that they're kind of picking up. But also, and I think this is a really important part, which speaks to the idea of evidence-based management, is to back those arguments and objective claims up with material which says, look, objectively, this is what's being said. So it's not a case of having to go in, and having worked in HR for a long time, it's that sense of trying to find a space which to be heard, if I'm brutally honest.
Yeah. You're talking to the students about, and their whole worldview is changing, and their view of how change works and how they operate in organizations shifts, and then they're going back into organizations that nobody else has gone through that experience with them. So how do they take that into the organization and go, that is, you've got it all wrong, it's different, it's not like that, it's much more complicated?
And they're like, oh no, he's gone on a course. If we keep our heads down, this will pass.
Well, see, and that's a fascinating tension. It genuinely is, because a lot of students for us, for example, are sponsored by their organization. So again, they have to manage that tension, because they may be, certainly you see this quite a bit when it comes to dissertation, for example, because the organization wants them to come in and do almost like a case study approach for their dissertation for the organization. Can't argue with that. That brings with it different ethical issues and kind of a position as a researcher, of course. But it's a really good question, Danny. And my first word would be tentatively, because this is something which, you're gaining a new identity. You're in a liminal space, which is, liminality is something I'm really fascinated by in terms of organizational change. Anyway, we may be able to get onto that a little bit later. But I also counsel them to say, look, don't be that person, as you just quite rightly said, Gary. Don't be that person who comes in and says, look, I've just started this course and therefore I have got all this knowledge. This is where, for me, the humility comes in, is to say, look, you need to be thinking, listening, and really kind of picking your moments. And as you very kindly spoke to in my sort of intro, the areas that I look at, some fancy academic words like structuralism and post-structuralism. What that really means is about the role of language and the role of identity. What those two kind of those two terms roughly translate into. Yeah, it's more about, you've got to. I encourage the students to make a leap of faith, because I think we've all been in meetings, and probably will be in meetings in our lives, where we've come out and gone, I wish I'd said something, or I wish I challenged something, or I don't think I feel that's quite right. And so it's about having the confidence to be able to take that leap of faith in a meeting with all the hierarchical symbolic power that may be in the room, or even in the room itself, in the chief exec's office or the boardroom, which is all its pictures of previous incumbents of the roles of leaders, and all this symbolic kind of heavy wood furniture or whatever. And it's to say, I don't agree, and this is the reasons I don't agree. And then you unpack the objective, balanced view of that, and it takes guts. And sometimes it will may not work as well as you want to, and because you are challenging people's assumptions. So again, it's about how you frame that and what language you use. So tentatively, Danny, but the point is to do it.
Start somewhere.
Yeah.
The other term I was going to get you to define, so in the introduction, Garen talked about you take a psychoanalytic approach to your work. Some of the people on the call who listen to the webinar might not understand that term. So can you define that for us? What does that mean? Different.
I will respond in a psychoanalysis is very difficult to unpack. So I'll give you my interpretation of it rather than a definition of it, because as with any field, that it's rife with what does it actually mean. But I'll give a sense of how I have used it and how I think it's useful. I'm also conscious of the fact that psychoanalysis has, it does have it can be viewed as being slightly troubling by certain aspects of thought or society. I see it very much as a way of privileging the irrational, privileging the unconscious. And why do I do that? Because, again, it comes back to this argument that somehow we are constantly rational beings, and organizations would like us to be rational. In fact, they hope that we are rational human beings. And that you can see that within all the kind of the discourses that you see traversing LinkedIn, or the kind of the practitioner press about bringing your whole self to work and bringing your authentic person to work. Arguably, from a psychoanalytic point of view, we're doing that already. It's just that we're spending a lot of time suppressing our authentic person at work, because if we brought our authentic personality to work, it'd be absolute chaos.
We were just talking about the same thing yesterday.
Yeah, that's the whole point of Freud's civilization and its discontents, is to say that to have a civilized society, we have to be able to repress our id, or our unconscious, because otherwise we'd just be going around and I'll leave it to the imagination what could be happening if that wasn't the case. So again, you can start to problematize terms such as authentic and bringing your whole self to work, and the fact that we are driven by forces which largely we don't even know and understand, and why we make decisions, why we do things, why we work in the organization we work in, why we like the people we like, why we make decisions that we make. We like to think that they are based on rationality, and a lot of it, and this is the fantasy part of it, is that we think that that's what we're doing, but actually a lot of it is being driven by things which are in the unconscious, and that we make those choices. So, and you can map that, and it's really, I think it's very productive and very useful. It's not the answer, and I think I'm always keen to point that out to people. It's that psychoanalysis somehow, if you are, and I'm in training to be a psychoanalyst as well, is that it's a clinical piece of work. That's where it's come from. So we have to be careful about that as well, because it's from a clinical base, and so the kind of extrapolation of that over the last 50 years has been fascinating and interesting. But we have to remind ourselves of that. But also, it's not about finding a cure, and it's not about finding a psychoanalyst doesn't have the ultimate answer. Far from it. It's actually holding a mirror up and saying, the fact that we believe that we may have the whole answer, that's the problem. And actually, what can we do to kind of unpack that a little bit? And that's why it's useful, I think, for me, to use that mirror in organizations, and then you can begin to unpack all sorts of things. You can unpack the idea of leadership, unpack the kind of idea of leadership and change, and so you can begin to slice it in different ways, because you're talking about the human condition. Clearly I find it fascinating. I wrote a PhD on it, so I must have found it fascinating, and I still do. But I'm very mindful of how I work with it and speak with it, but I do introduce it because I think it's important for students. And again, they grapple with it, and some really love it, some really hate it. But that's ambivalence. So that's a beautiful place to be, because I can ask questions. Well, what is it about this that makes you feel uncomfortable? Or what is it that you find enjoyment about this? So yeah, it's another tool. But it's not the tool.
Yeah, and a question I'm burning to ask, because you've just come. When we first met, we met in September. You were just about to initiate term 1 for a new inductee of 200 people, and it's almost like that rite of passage. It's like starting to sort of understand identity and what do I bring into change and all that. And you kind of use the term "hold the mirror up." And just for Danny and I were just sort of saying that we've just been working on change projects this week. Danny looks great. I look like I've aged 20 years, because the mirror isn't completely reflective, is it? Because you have, when you're in the room, holding a space where there is conflict going on and some really deep things going on, that work that you do with them on that first term, where they start to question who they are and what they bring and what beliefs they hold and the assumptions they make, that is a critical path. And sometimes that's underestimated, isn't it, as part of the foundation of the work?
Absolutely. And I think, and the pair of you know that you've had a tough week working and delivering, and yes, the pair of you look extremely fresh and healthy. I don't know how you do it. Whatever your secret is, let me know, because that'd be wonderful. But yeah, it is. But again, it's what I see, and again, academic and researcher evidence is obviously key. What has been, I'll give you two examples. One that I find very satisfying is that I tend to find students contacting me, whatever period after they finish their studies, saying, on one hand, do you know what? I really didn't like your module. However, 4 years later, I really begin to understand why you were getting us to do this. And actually, I've started to think and act and perform and work in different ways because of that. Now, that's not just me. I'm just opening up a space for them to think and reflect upon themselves. It's just giving them a guidance. And that's what, I kind of treat teaching as being taking stuff out of a box, trying to fill up the students. The student isn't a box that needs to be filled up. It's more about unlearning, more about taking stuff out and providing space rather than just constantly just filling stuff up. So that's joyful that they've found worth on that. And I think in the moment in time, when you are with students and having these discussions with, because quite rightly, students will bring in issues that they're currently facing at work, and we'll discuss those and we'll speak to those in seminars and what have you, is the kind of sense of liberation and slightly emancipatory spirit this provides for them, which you get a lot of students saying, I didn't realize you could think about these things in these ways. And what is education other than that? I mean, it's about arguably just giving people a space to go, I need to, I didn't realize this, or this is something fascinates me, and it's challenging me, and it's making me think about the way I am and how I do things, how I'm dealing with these issues at work, whatever they may be. And arguably that's forms part of what Lewin and Tavistock were trying to achieve with OD itself back when it was being co-authored and put forward, post-war in those years after the Second World War. Because let's not forget, the psychologists and that were used in the war were then asked post-war to come up with a way of trying to understand the different shape of the workforce that was caused by the war. And that's arguably where OD began, and kind of taking a more humanistic approach to organization spaces. But it was heavily influenced by psychodynamics. So that I always go back and say, well, actually, do you know what? Psychology itself and change has an enormous debt to the work of psychoanalysis and psychodynamics. It doesn't like to talk about it, and it kind of keeps it under wraps. And I give another example to students, say, all those questionnaires that you take, asking you to answer 100 questions. What do you think they're trying to tap into about motivation, for example? And I say, oh, well, about motivation. But I say, yeah, but what is motivation? Can you see it? And they, no. Well, what is it then? If you can't see it and it's driving something, are there ways that we can map that across to the unconscious? And it's like, yeah, well, you can. And psychology in some ways is trying to measure the unconscious. Good luck with that, I say. But anyway, that's something which is, again, having that approach is still useful because still evidence, and again, another thing that we very much push, which is that we don't privilege, a quantitative view over a qualitative view. They both have differing ways of understanding what knowledge is and what we can do with it, but neither is better than the other, and they both have flaws. So I think it's very much, as speak to your point, Gary, it's for students is that lots of revelations and the emotion, the effect. I mean, we could spend a whole podcast talking about the role of emotion in change, or indeed in research and the ways in which organizations are looked at. But I think for the experience that I've had and have continued to have, that's why it's a privilege to do it, is to hear these people's stories, hear student stories, to hear how they've grappled with some quite traumatic things in terms of change in organizations, but also some joyful things in relation to change. And it's good to then, it's very powerful for peer-to-peer kind of telling of these stories. So yeah, there's a lot going on to hold those spaces, but again, it's a joy to do.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of rewriting of people's pasts, like reflecting, and that's the revelation, isn't it, as well? And I really like what you're saying about the importance of education, because there's so much from that time of being on a master's. It reminds me of something. I went to my partner's graduation, and the dean made a risque comment. She said, "The difference between education and training. I want my daughter to be educated about sex, not trained in it." Which I thought was is kind of the importance of just like knowing about it and being educated in it, and that time for people to learn the theories and what do they mean, and the implicative effect of applying them as well, rather than not just going and doing stuff.
Yeah, and yes, absolutely. I mean, I think I mean, at the end of it's incumbent on all of us to take responsibility for our actions, clearly. And the same goes for students. I mean, having a space to do that is that, yes, what responsibility are you going to go and take to go and actually do and utilize some of these things? So it goes back to your point, Danny, of how do I make this happen in organizations? Because that's where the praxis comes in. That's where you take the theory and you say, well, okay, rather than running another survey around employee engagement, for example. And I think Garen, I've told you this story when we first met, but I remember I used to be part of an HR directors network, and you get, as ever, you get these kind of round emails from colleagues saying, I'm having to do this, any ideas, any thoughts? And this one came around saying, we want to change our employee engagement survey provider, and we want to run the survey again. Any ideas? And I remember I just sent one back. I just said, yeah, absolutely, don't run one. And there was this kind of it was a provocation, absolutely. But the point was based on why do you need to read one? Why do you need to run one? What are you trying to achieve with it? Are you conscious of the issues that surround, for example, the kind of validity and reliability and the actual situating of the idea of employee engagement? What is the outcome that you're hoping for? Is it you want to run a survey because it looks good to run it? What decisions are you being basing on that? And so all of unpacking that a little bit, and hence this is before I joined academia fully. So even then I was in training.
You were ready
towards it. Yeah. After that, I had my own trouble because I was made redundant. So I kind of, I don't think it was because of that email. Could have been, who knows? But the point is that we have to question practice, and we have to question why we do things. And again, repetition is another part of psychoanalytic thought, which is that we repeat things because it makes us feel comfortable.
And the question we're dying to ask is what is your journey into OD? You've obviously had a really interesting experience in the field, and then made that decision to go into academia. What was your journey?
It started more with being asked to take up kind of an L&D kind of approach. So when I was working at HMV, there was at the height of its kind of growth and powers, which now is a long time ago now. When I was working in the kind of the accountancy side, again, you think about your careers, you think, what was it? Why was I doing that? I was rubbish. That really wasn't me. But I was asked if I could possibly deliver some training for aspiring managers, graduates, around the use of financial measures, instruments in their stores and in their kind of their development as well. So I did that, and I appeared to be quite good at that, and getting those kind of things across in an interesting way, but also a challenging way for the kind of the management team. So that I kept on getting asked to do more and more and more. So in the end, I kind of was then asked to join the L&D department, which then opened it up into kind of doing my MCIPD qualifications and training and all those type of things. So much wider kind of aspects of it took me to leadership and took me into selection assessment and all these type of things. So much so that I then left there and had a proper HRM role at the British Library, and was asked to do similar. I had a kind of a floating remit, actually, which was fascinating because it took in L&D, but it also moved into organizational design and organizational development. Because at that point, which was around about 2004, the library had just moved which was fascinating. And looking back at this is fascinating for me. I didn't really get it at the time, but the library had only just moved from where it was in the British Museum into its new space on Euston Road. And the fascinating thing about the Euston Road building is that it's designed to look like a ship. So the architect was a big not a salesperson, a salesperson and a sailor are two different things.
Probably both, actually.
So a sailor, but perhaps he clearly was a salesperson in getting the contract. But it's built, if you look at it, if you ever see it, it's built very much like a tear down, so it looks like an ocean liner. And it's only latterly did it kind of make me realize that at the top were all the kind of the hierarchy, the power, the chief exec and the buildings, all the nice, and then right at the bottom, and the British Library underneath the front plaza is deeper than the underground, and that's where all of the kind of the documents and kept, but also that's where the low grade workers are. So the metaphor between that and you only have to look at the film Titanic and look at steerage and look at the it resonates even there. And then they begin to there was problems of the fact of organizational change from a building for the British Museum. People felt that they'd lost kudos and gravitas by moving from the British Museum to this brand new building which wasn't theirs. There was lots of ghosts because people didn't travel with them from the British Museum because people left. So as an organizational change, I joined it very much now looking back on it and thinking, oh, there was so many things going on there. But anyway, so I did that and I worked, and that's when I kind of moved more into the OD and a kind of mix of OD, ER, L&D, HRM, less kind of operational HRM, although that was part of it. So I did that, and then I moved on to working at Sotheby's, and that was more of a HR kind of, and operations role as a director. And that was again having to go through that and think about how that was situated in terms of where they were as an organization. And in the meantime, I'd started doing I'd never been to university before, so I'd got all my CIPD qualifications. I did all these things, and I got to a point I thought, well, I've always been fascinated by organizations and psychology. Is there anywhere I can do this, knowing full well that I can't give up work because I've got a family, I've got a mortgage, and all these type of things. And I saw a poster, Birkbeck, and you can study in the evenings. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I went along thinking I'd just find out. Cut long story short, managed to get in, did my part-time masters. Literally after the first week of walking in there, I went, oh, this is my world. This is again, when I see these new students, I'm embodied that experience from 13 years ago, because I can still remember the excitement and being challenged and thinking about all of these things. And it really was a space of opening up, thinking, I didn't realize you could speak about these things. I didn't realize you could think about these things in such ways. So it really resonated. So much so that my supervisor said, do you want to do a PhD? I've never even thought about it. I thought, well, how can I do that? I've never been to university before. What's going on? To the point, well, yeah, done it. So and that has been provided to me. And that was how I could then move into the kind of psychoanalytic space, because that's what my PhD was around. Using psychoanalysis in conversation with employee engagement. So hence you can see why my email back to the HR director group was based around kind of my own research as well. So that's the kind of sense. And then once I'd started tutoring and taking seminar jobs and all this time and trying to find a way. And I'm very fortunate. I managed to get into a full-time role in academia, which I know is very tricky these days. And then I got asked if I would take over the module on organizations and change. And I just literally jumped at it, because that was the first module I ever took in my master's. That was the bit that I opened up these doors. And I thought, how often do you get an opportunity to do this? So I jumped at it. So that's hence why I've just kind of bobbed and weaved my way through a fairly non-linear career. But then again, one of my modules, I asked my students to map out their career in a visual way, and it's really fascinating, because then it's worth us all doing it, actually, because you suddenly look at where our careers have gone and been and moved and shifted, and our life spaces, where we were at and why the decisions we made. It's a fascinating way to do it and to think about it.
You said when we had a pre-call, you talked about how passionate you are about music. How does that shape, inform, what the right word is, to the work that you do? How do they link?
They do link. It is a passion. I've had a parallel career, is far too grand a word for it, but I've a parallel life where I've been a musician with gaps, which other life events have taken over, but it always has and remains a passionate area for me. The ways in which I've grown actually to kind of understand it more, Danny, is that I kind of look and think about the times I've spent in recording studios in my life, and what is fascinating about it as a creative act is that you are you're turning up in a space with ideas, and you are being mediated through technology and from a person who is managing that technology for you at that point, because you don't know how it works and they are the master and they know the stuff, and you're hoping to end up with a product that is kind of replicates what's in here, which always carries with it a slight level of disappointment because it's never quite what is actually in here, or what was in the plan, or what was in the project brief. So you can begin to see where the kind of the parallels start to interweave with this in organizational spaces. And so you spend time and money and resource sitting down and trying to create these things, and then you end up with these things. But all of these things are created by different elements. So if you're in a 24-track recording studio, you've got 24 tracks to play with. So you record the drums, you record the bass, the vocals, whatever instrumentation that you've got. So you record all those bass things, and then you start to mix them. And then, of course, the mixing is just a form of interpretation. And then you have the tensions within the group of people who are in that room, arguably, from my experience, you've got 4 people in the room. So you've got drums, bass, guitar, and a vocalist. And of course, each of those 4 people are vying for their own voice or choir instrument to be pronounced. So you'll be sitting. Why can I make the guitar a bit louder? I was a guitarist, so can I make the guitar a bit louder? And then the vocalist say, yeah, but I can't hear my voice then. And then the drummer says, yeah, but we're kind of losing this. So again, there's the kind of psychodynamic aspects of it, the kind of the power going on, negotiation, the ways in which arguably you're the person who's mixing or producing it for you, or mixing it rather than producing, will have an objective voice and say, well, actually, you don't need to do this, and maybe this would be better. So you got an objective voice trying to guide you, and then you end up with a product. You come away with this kind of mixed thing, and then you try and do something with it, and it's an artifact. It's a point in time that you then go and try and sell, or get other people to courage to come and witness you play live or buy your records. Or that didn't happen a lot in my life, to be fair, buying records, or indeed people coming along to gigs. I was always strengthened by the fact that U2 had 3 people at their first gig. I think that changed a bit. So the parallels, hopefully I'm unpacking that a little bit, because I can't see that within organizations, that you have this space which you're trying to be creative. You get interview, you've got all these different voices, you've got the politics, you've got the power, you've got the tensions, you've got the ways in which you mix all these voices together to actually get a product which you actually want. And then sometimes with organizational change, you can then extend the metaphor, which is say, okay, we need to remix this, and so you get all of the original tapes, or the hard drives these days, and you go in and you go back to the base material, and you say, perhaps we need to think about how we mix this again because it's not quite working, or it's for me, I think it's clearly it resonates for me, but I think it's for me, it's quite a useful way of thinking about that. And I use jazz in the organizational change module right towards the end, kind of pick up on the idea of chaos, because lots of people, if you hear kind of more avant-garde or jazz, which sounds like an absolute racket, which arguably it does, but that's the point of it, is that it may sound completely out of control, completely, but it can only be like that because there is such a strong understanding within the players, and a plan and a project and a way of doing things, of knowing where they're going to be and what they're doing, that allows them to be that off kilter, to be out of sync or whatever, because ultimately it will always come back. There will always be, generally there'll be a resolution. And I think that's a nice way of thinking about organizational change as well, is that much with classical music, there's, when you get to the end chord, generally there's a resolution, which means that there's this kind of, it kind of sums it up and it leaves it like a nicely tidied up piece of culture. That's great. It would be nice to have a resolution, and sometimes there are, and that can be quite fleeting, and it moves on, it's transient. And I think that, again, the idea of music that hasn't got a resolution. So me thinking about the avant-garde music, which is quite uncomfortable. Tonally, it may make you feel uncomfortable with it. That doesn't sound nice, or a racket, or there's no resolution, because there's no nice tidying up. But that's life too, and that's organizations and change as well. So there are various ways, I think, of how you can unpack that metaphor, and I just find it useful. And I speak to it again, not as an overarching meta narrative that says everyone start thinking about this in musical terms, but those who are musical, it does resonate. They come back and say, yeah, I kind of get that. We don't have to be a musician to resonate with that. I think it's a useful metaphor.
What do you enjoy most about the work that you do?
Every year, in the professional development module that I take in the autumn as well, which is mainly it's HRM students and consultancy students, I get them to do a lot of self-reflection. So I get them to use a lot of tools, a lot of self-questionnaires, and I take the self-questionnaire every year again, because I just want to see if there's a change, see if what's got, and kind of remind myself of this whole process. And I don't know what it was about this year. I perhaps answered it more honestly than I ever have done before. Life changes, career changes, world changes. You think, well, actually, you know what? Let's just answer this perhaps in a different way. And what was illuminating for me was, I got the results back, was how much I am driven by creativity and freedom and ability to challenge and all these type of things. And it just made me realize, as a response to your question, Danny, was that how much of that I now have within this role, and how much of that I didn't have in my previous roles when I was outside of academia, and how that clearly affected me, and about how it affected my own approach, my own well-being, my own mental spaces, my own frustrations. So it was a reminder, if I needed it, of how lucky and privileged I am to be working in academia, and what academia can, and academia has its faults and it has its problems, and it has, but it, for the first time in my life, I'm being able to work in a space where I'm responsible for everything that I do. I don't have a line manager hovering over me, asking me for reports every day or whatever. None of that. It's more a case that I can go out and I have a space to experiment and to speak and to push and to utilize material and academic material, my own practitioner focuses, and to engage with colleagues like yourself and with wider spaces, to see how it lands and to push people and to provoke. I do like provoking people, and I don't mean that in a way that I do it for fun, or that it's somehow that have this slightly sadist or approach to life. Far from it. I just think, given what I've experienced, and this year was the 40 years that I've been working, so that was that made me stop and think as well. I think 40 years is a long time.
I think one of the things I enjoyed most, particularly when you came in and did the session with us, is that you have the ability to question the question. So when people ask a question, there's often a huge assumption in there, isn't there? And it says so much, and it's the ability to slow things down and say, well, the question that you're asking, where's that going? What assumptions are you making there? Like, what are you trying to lead here? And that's such an important tool, isn't it? The ability to sort of slow things down and make people question before they leap.
Yeah, funnily enough, Gary, there was a paper this week that my students were looking at, which there's a really useful paper by Bush and Marshak, and I can share the paper for listeners if they want to explore it. But this was just a kind of a chapter by Marshak. He was talking about his consulting experiences, and talking about how the idea of deep listening when you're in consultancy spaces, in terms of change, for example, is really important, because it allows you to pick out those words, which, and this comes back to the mirroring aspect again, that you can pick out and just send back to who's just spoken the words. So it might be resistance. They might say there's always a lot of resistance about things, blah 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 blah, for a reason for why not to do something, or that it's never happened before. But just by picking that one word and sending it back to them, it's very powerful. It shows that you've been listening, but it also highlights to the listener sort of key phrase or a key way which may be blocking why they're doing they're not doing something. And it comes back to this confidence thing, because that might be a leader. That might be, for a consultant, might be the person who is going to give you the contract. It might be, the person who, if you're in HRM, that is going to sign off on a project, or that is, again, so it's that sense of, and it can be, when you're doing that to those people, who may find that challenging because they are the leader, or symbolically or hierarchically, they're not used to it. They may respond in ways which are not comfortable. That arguably says more about them as a leader than it does about you as the person questioning it. So again, it's about having that confidence and the gravitas, and it's a term I don't like, resilience, but I'm going to use it, resilience, to keep on going back and being knocked down and getting up and doing it again. Because it comes back to the ethics, I'd say, the ethics of organizational change and the humility, but also that generosity that we have to have when we're dealing with people one-to-one and thinking about these situations, because that leader may be obdurate and difficult, but they're still a human being. And why is it that they are being obdurate and difficult, and what pressures are they under? So I think that kind of coaching aspect of it is really interesting as well from an OD point of view.
I guess there's expectations in their response as well, isn't there? There's this, again, that humility, which is, well, surely I've given them the feedback. Surely they should have the cathartic moment now, shouldn't they?
Yeah.
But sometimes people listen in hindsight. Sometimes they have to process it, whatever it is for them as well. So I guess that's an important element of helping people.
It really is, absolutely. And it's that, yes, you can hope that they're going to have a cathartic moment, and it's not always the case. And sometimes I'll argue it's quite a rarity, because it becomes back down to organizational identity, because intertwined with the humility as from a leadership point of view is also recognizing, can I show that I have fragility? Am I able? Because it comes down to psychological safety, comes down to the culture in the organization, comes down to the context. And that one word, I'd say, is the one I use so much in my daily life with students and academia generally, is context. Because again, you can read about all these projects, you can academic papers or practitioner papers, case studies, XYZ, whatever. But you always have to think about the context, and to think, well, just because this worked here doesn't necessarily mean by doing that it's going to work here. So again, it's having that kind of flexibility, humility, however you want to place it, to say, yes, there's useful things to learn from here. It's not a given that by following, and that's part of the reason why I have an issue with the end-step models, is that you can do that here, but it's not going to be the same results. Why would you think it's going to be the same result there? If you think it's going to be the same result there, that's another problem. That's another issue that you're going to have to try and contend with, because much like thinking about the product you get from a recording studio, what you desire at that point is never going to be it. And that's the point of desire, because desire is never fulfilled. It's always, and that's what we have in our lives. We absolutely do.
And it's really easy, isn't it, in hindsight, to say, oh, we followed a 5-step process, when the reality was it was very wiggly and all over the place, and there were lots of things at play. And when we're looking at back in hindsight, we saw, well, we did A and we did B, and then C happened, and then D, and we ended up with E, as if it was all planned and beautifully laid out.
Well, and Danny, that speaks rather beautifully what Gary was talking to a while ago about how we narrate and reconstruct our own self-identities and stories. Because in organizations, organizations are either on one aspect, you can say they are something that are there in reality, that they're, that you can measure them, you can see them, or there's another argument that says that organizations are socially constructed. We create the organizations through our narratives, through our stories, through our myths, through what we talk about, how we create the organization. So yeah, absolutely, that retroactive action on and it's interesting, isn't it, to see how, and we're all slightly guilty of this, about how we narrate those to make us look good. And organizations do it, consultancies do it, governments do it, everyone does it. It's about how do you reshift and reframe those narratives to actually get a good outcome. Nothing wrong with that. It's just that if you start to believe those stories constantly, then that they are a thing, that are the concrete reality, then you begin to see where their problems arise.
Social constructionism is what gave me an identity crisis. So one question we really want, and it seems like it's a good time to do it, 40 years. I feel there should be some kind of celebration or a present for achieving that. But you speak to people from organizations from across sectors, across different regions of the world. What do you see as some of the key challenges organizations are facing right now?
Surprisingly, I don't think some of the real issues are anything new. And that's both unsurprising and a bit saddening, because I think there's always there was an email that came around today from one of the HR magazines, blah, 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 talking about how L&D should have a voice in the C-suite. And I'm thinking, yeah, but this conversation has been going on for a long time around, the HR should have a voice in the C-suite, or how can HR be taken more seriously? And I don't mean that in a, I'm not saying that in a kind of for comedic effect. I think it needs to be. So this is self-questioning and self-understanding of identity, and you can put that on the HRM profession arguably as well. Is to say, well, these aren't new conversations. And there was a bit that's saying, well, is it OD? I think it was talking about organizational transformation rather than. It's like, well, that's just a change of a word. I mean, that doesn't mean anything really. If you want to change it from one word to another, what does that actually mean? A bit like moving from employee engagement from satisfaction. It's like, well, arguably there's very little difference. So I think sadly there's stuff which has been, and if I take a psychoanalytic point of view, repressed. And with repression, you get symptoms, because symptoms are the kind of the eruptions of what's been repressed. So the issues, the problems which happen, which constantly turn up because they haven't been addressed. So I think, to answer you, if you were to push me to have the ideas, is that, well, okay, firstly, what is the role of, for example, HRM in terms of their voice and their position in relation to organizations, and about how are they seen? Are they seen as purely policy and practice and making sure that the voice of the leaders are undertaken and delivered, or are they holding a middle ground between both the leaders and for the workers as such? How is that going to translate with a new government that wishes to perhaps bring together a more cohesive kind of unionized kind of approach to that, and to think about legislation? So that's going to be interesting. I think that's going to be useful and productive. So I think there's that. I think, yeah, I mean, AI, I mean, who knows? I mean, I mean, it's such, and that's part of the issue with AI is that it's so difficult to define and to think about what it can possibly mean. I mean, we've been here before about the ways in which, I remember when I first started working about having paperless offices. 40 years later, there's still plenty of paper flying around. But there's the AI. I think it could be misleading. I mean, it'll be what it is. I mean, I think it's a bigger issue for globally, for mankind, existentially, rather than it just being an organizational thing. And we struggle with that in higher education, around the ways in which it's utilized to create coursework, for example. So we're struggling with that. I'd say what's interesting also is that I also seen in the press in the last slow building up of this approach to having a 4-day working week, which again, a plug for my colleagues in the business school. Professor Pedro Gomez has been working on a project in Portugal for the last 5 years, 4 or 5 years, with the government and seeing what the outcomes of that is. He's an economist and social psychologist as such, and what wonderful outcomes they've already seen in that. So that has been, there's empirical evidence on that. So that'd be interesting, because that's a culture change, that's a shift. We're seeing a lot more organizations, and I wish they weren't doing this, demanding people to come back into the offices with no real argument for why that's the case. And there's plenty of empirical evidence to show that before COVID, organizations didn't, and I'll say it, trust workers to work from home. They felt that actually they were going to be doing their washing and reading and life stuff. But empirical evidence will show that actually workers who work from home worked harder, because there was an element of guilt, because they felt that actually this is quite nice, and actually I don't want to take it as being, I don't want to take take this for granted, and actually I'm going to do more because I'm not being seen. I want to show that I'm being productive. COVID strikes, all of a sudden everyone who could possibly work at home, I think we need to remind everyone that not everyone could work from home during the COVID crisis, was that, guess what, the economy didn't flatline. The people still did their jobs, people still did things, people, and yes, there are costs, mental health issues, in kind of atomization of us as people, as workers, but things carried on. So I think that's going to be interesting. So culture for the change in organizations, and arguably I really would wish that organizations were far more transparent and open about why they want people to come back into the workplace and what that's being based on. There's no point talking about evidence-based management and then just ignoring it when it suits you. So there's that. So that would be interesting. I think the ways in which jobs and organizations are kind of situated and crafted, and how people are expected to do that, is going to be ongoing. But thinking about change, and this is all about change. I think this is just the point about bringing it, tying it back into how we view change, and thinking that it's not something that is just to be explored and investigated as a thing that can be nicely, neatly delimited into this thing. It underpins everything daily, hourly, on a minute basis of what we do and how we do it. And maybe turning our minds to that and helping us all develop better ways of managing, confronting, challenging that, thinking about how we support each other. It kind of comes back to the generosity and humility, thinking about the embodied performance, about the effects on us as human beings and the planet. Let's not forget that. I think those are the real kind of core tenets. And it's powerful, I think, to see that organizations and thought leaders in various areas are beginning to think about this more cohesively and more cogently, about workers' well-being, organizational well-being. Those things really do matter, especially in a world where knowledge work is privileged. So what does that actually mean? Knowledge, it's embodied, it's us. So we've gone from making things to us being the things which organizations want. So again, that then leads into selection and recruitment, so assessment. So it's about how do we have fairer and more inclusive approaches to recruitment and selection in organizations. So again, it's all about context. It's overdetermined. There's the interconnectivity of all these things. Yes, we can separate certain things out and look at them and study them and talk about them. But I think it's that overarching view of all of this and saying, well, actually, how can we help each other to understand this from a kind of meta point of view, rather than thinking about these things? If we only we could change the way we look at leadership, for example, which we need to do, that will solve everything, because then that just means that all we're doing is that we want leaders. We get the leaders we deserve.
There's so much. I'm so glad we asked, because I think it's really important to look forward and look at the implications of things that are happening around us. One question that we always ask in every episode is, what advice would you give someone who's considering a career in organization development? So they're either maybe just starting to see the possibility of it, or they're thinking of taking their first steps. What advice would you give?
I would say approach it with a sense of joy, a sense of wanting to explore, to lessen one's grip on, this is going back to what I've been speaking to generally in this session, is to prepare yourself to lessen your grip on your worldview. I would definitely urge them, if you were thinking of a career in OD, or indeed generally within organizational spheres, is to develop your listening capabilities, because we get taught how to read, write, blah, blah, blah. We do not get taught how to listen. And listening is quite remarkable when you are able to listen deeply. And it takes a lot of time and effort. And again, this comes back to the embodied performance of it, to be able to then respond back to someone in front of you in a way which is meaningful, but is also a critical aspect of it, which will affect meaningful conversations and change. And I think that's part of it. I think that if you can afford to go into therapy as well whilst you're doing these type of things, I think everyone would benefit from therapy. I really believe that. It's a shame that it's not available, or indeed people are able to afford to do it in lots of spaces. But I think going for an OD perspective, you're asking to take on a lot. I think that mirrors what's in the world of HRM too. I have absolute respect for anyone who wants to work in OD and HR, or any people-focused space, because having to deal with human beings is hard. We're hard. We're complex, tricky, dangerous, irrational, fantasy-led things. And trying to lead those things, trying to change those things, trying to motivate those things, trying to get those things to listen, to behave, to whatever, is hard work. And I think giving yourself a bit of space to not to be hard on yourself if you want to become an OD practitioner or an HRM practitioner or whatever, I think is a real key part to it, because you're going to have to look after yourself. I think that's a really important part of it. And to hang on to those moments of joy, and they will help build capacity for those moments of non-joy which will inevitably come and batter you around the psyche.
Amen to all of that.
and to be honest, and I hope, I mean, I do mean this with absolute sincerity, is to engage with practices such as this and with people like yourselves and networks, and to share those stories and to recognize and realize that you're not alone. And I think when you're working with people and working these, you can end up feeling very alone. And you can feel that somehow that the whole burden of humanity is on you, that somehow you couldn't work out person X, or that you tried to do this with a group of people and it didn't quite work. Yeah, that's going to happen. And if you get comfortable with the idea of failure and lack and loss, rather than that being a downside, that is empowering. So I think, utilizing the resources that you so bravely put out to people and take time to do, I think is really important, to hear different voices. And to know that you're not alone.
Yeah, well, what a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much, Mark, for being really generous with your time and your insights. There's just so many sort of takeaways, and I feel as if we're just scratching the surface. There's things that we want to cover about liminality, and just fascinated about your PhD work on women's journey into boards, because that's a whole area of research that's just fascinating as well. Danny, what are some of the things that you want to take away from today?
Gosh, where to start? I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been really insightful. So I think I was struck by what you said earlier in the conversation about the importance of being tentative with your challenge, but making sure you do it. And I think a lot of aspiring OD practitioners and established OD practitioners, is having confidence to do that in various situations. I love what you said towards the end about lessening your grip on your worldview. So important. If we can all do that, then really important. The importance of context, and then what you said about the importance of unlearning. And actually, we don't need to pack our brains with more stuff. It's taking stuff out and creating space to think and view the world differently.
You got all mine, actually. Mine were all those. And then there's just one thing that's probably going to wake me up at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is symptoms of the eruption of what's been repressed. Wow.
Yeah.
There's an episode title.
Yeah. And I'll give you that. If that's waking you up at 3 o'clock in the morning, Gary, and then you may probably want to ask yourself why taking that.
But what does it mean?
Well, I really am not in a place to give you a place to wake you up and or cause that kind of psychic trauma. That wasn't the aim of this session. Really.
Oh no, it's thought provoking, which is.
Yeah, thank you for offering me the space to do this, and I think I've learned a lot, and it's very valuable, I think, to have a space to speak. And I think that's one of the key things that I'd hope that is a takeaway from this, is that it comes back to your point, Danny, about being the tentative, and is that lots of times in organizations one feels that one can't or doesn't have the opportunity. And this is why it links to the idea of employee voice, these type of things. It's that's what voice is. It's about talking. And I think it's not just talking, it's about where and how things are spoken about, and the bravery and the confidence for people to listen and challenge what is being spoken about. And I think that is, and giving others who haven't got a space to speak, a space to speak. And I think that's of vital importance to not only OD, but to organisational and to life in general, honestly, to be honest.
And if people want to follow your work, or if they're interested in the programs at Birbeck that you oversee, obviously you're a prolific author as well. What's the best way for someone to follow your work, Mark?
Well, we'd love them to come and study with us. That would be absolutely wonderful. If not, then they can certainly, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to happy to link in with people. I'm also happy to have conversations with people who maybe want to pick up on some of these points, and they can email me. I'm on my contact details are on the Birbeck Business School website, and hopefully at some point I can come and do another session for you guys. And that's always great to see the whites of people's eyes when you ask them a question which may be uncomfortable, and to have that conversation in a space which, as we did in the summer, which was a really productive space. So yeah, I'm always happy to contact and discuss this at any parts of this at great length, because I learn so much from doing it too. So it's a beneficial process.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate it. For those of you who are listening, if you have enjoyed the conversation, then please do hit the like button, or feel free to share this with others that you think will benefit from it as well. And also feel free to subscribe to the channel. Mark joins an incredible portfolio of amazing guests that we've had join us from around the world and across the OD profession. And Mark's conversation will take a really proud part of that. We hope you've really found value. If you have any thoughts or feedback on what Mark shared with you today, so please put them in the comments. We love to hear your feedback. And if you've got any questions for Mark, we're happy to pass them on as well. But again, thank you so much for your time, Mark. It's been brilliant. We've loved it. It's been a great episode. And thank you again.
No, thank you. And thank you for your generosity, and to you, all the listeners as well. So thank you.